Their foods tend to be rather uniform, Nasu began as he escorted them past the buffet spread over a bench on one side of the amphitheater. A mix of the same basic ingredients, taken in different quantities. Rice is a staple here, and you are welcome to it, but mind your portions. The brownies have invited you to join them in drinking nin, but keep in mind it is fermented. If you look in the jugs at the end here, you will see that the akoyo and minu from which it is brewed float on the top, while the sprouts drain nin from beneath. The fruits are edible, but also fermented in this stage. Nasu turned his attention to the earthenware platters brimming with stews and slices of exotic floral fleshes cooked in warm shades of brown, purple, and gray. Those are traditionally eaten with this bitter flatbread. You may have the bread, but you cannot eat this, or that. He pointed toward specific dishes indistinguishable from the rest of the fare. The brownie's diet is largely vegetarian, save for the occasional insect stock, and favors various fungal growths which will render you quite ill. Nasu's description of the food carried on for some time. Occasionally he would turn to frighten everyone with questions to assure that they had caught every word he said. The food looked palatable. The teal glaze in the pottery accented the muted colors of the steaming food. Learning that much of it was cooked with the oil of a nauseous mountain cactus, however, kept everyone quite wary of the dishes. Nasu lifted the lid of an oblong pot and leaned in to bury his nose in the billowing steam. You can eat that, but I would not suggest it. Then he smiled brightly. Those, he pointed to a platter piled with glossy pale lumps, are delicious. They use marshmallow and rice to make a cake and fill it with fruit and preserve. Only they are hard to make. Best not seem too greedy. Take only one and be sure to share it with a brownie. Are the sunsets always this beautiful? Eloise asked, staring across the burning horizon. You have come at a good time of year, Rusty remarked. In the winter, the sunsets are crisp, with pale pastels painting the sky. Summer heat brings different currents and winds, and fuels the intensity of the sunset. As the purple night overtook the sky, the bonfire became their primary source of illumination. The flame sprang twice the height of the brownies, who bounced around it, and even challenged Nasu's towering stature. The conflagration lifted the smoke over the festivities, spoiling only a small patch of slope far downwind that was easily avoided. The valley echoed with Orcon's laughter as he watched the brownies' merriment and the light-footed springing of Rusty around the fire. They danced to syncopated rhythms set by the clatter of the gourd shakers decked with shell-beaded mesh and the rapping of sticks against textured surfaces and drums. The experienced musicians would not let their play root them to one spot. They climbed from their seats and wriggled with the others, keeping the tempo the entire time. Two very talented percussionists, and one whose quality was lacking, turned their gourds over and began to blow across the vessel's hollow neck, creating a deep humming noise. The bounce in their step stuttered their breath, creating a second rhythm within the rattling of the shells. Each gourd held its own pitch, and, by alternating who blew on any particular step, the musicians managed to create a rudimentary melody to play amid the beats. Cassandra had found that her seat beside Orcon was perhaps not as felicitous as she had originally assumed. She found herself ducking every thunderous clap of laughter, but Orcon's good humor kept the distraction from souring the festive atmosphere. She tucked herself deeper in her black robes to keep back the chill of the night air, and picked through the wooden bowl on her lap filled with now cold portions. So far, she had managed to avoid any of the sickening foods. Darrell had not fared as well, and was brought under by either a trace of cactus oil or too much nin. Terracon spun out from the ring of dancers around the fire, and stumbled to fall to all four at Cassandra's feet. His bare arms and face glistened, and sweat dripped from his matted hair. His lungs rustled within him. They were choked by smoke, starved from exhaustion, and wrenching against the joy that clamored to giggle out. "Come with," he panted at Cassandra, pulling her down as much as he tried to pull himself up. She yelped, but Terracon found his footing quickly enough to keep her up. "Wait!" Terracon had already begun to drag her down the slope, and Orcon was cheering her participation. "I do not want to dance," she insisted. "You have to. Please, with me." He asked her. It was something he wanted to do. How could she deny him? What? How? Her questions drowned in the symphony. They were dragged into the orbit of bodies around the fire. Terracon slipped beneath her arm and turned away from her. Unsure where to go, she found herself stalling against the other dancer's Whirlpool Motion. Terracon completed his turn to find Cassandra facing him. He cracked a patronizing smile and took her by the shoulder to guide her step to the side. He laced an arm back and behind him to catch her hip. He pressed, inviting her to turn, which she did. The close of her rotation found them back to back. He shuffled behind her and took her opposite hip in his hand, again indicating a turn that kept her faced away from him. "I never see you," she screamed over the music. "That's the point," he hollered his reply, shuffled and turned again. Nearby, dancers caught the squabble, but made light humor of the situation. Matronly brownies, with their pendulous breasts swaying to the tune, swarmed on Cassandra, surrounding her with their squinting smiles. In groups who shimmied and swayed their way around the couple, they pushed Cassandra back and forth, or pressed her to turn, counter Terracon, who seemed only too comfortable with the music. The crones would throw their hands in the air and bark their laughter to excite Cassandra to shirk, which they seemed to appreciate as an addition to the dancing. Even with their help, one theme remained. Terracon and Cassandra almost never looked at one another. Their eyes would pass a glimpse only when they turned, which seemed to coincide with every third downbeat. Secure in that steady rhythm, keeping the motion back and forth came naturally. Exact footing held much less regard here than it did at De Toutal. 6 months were spent training for a single presentation of ritual behavior. It should have been reserved for a second daughter, a house virgin. Upon the declaration of the approach of De Toutal, however, she was the only candidate. It was almost all ruined by him and his weakness for her eyes. Cassandra turned again, trading the only momentary glance she could with Terracon. What relief! Here their eyes did not meet. He could not be weak for her, and she could not break him. They could only dance, almost only for themselves, but they could dance together. They spun out from the circle, trying to steady their balance while they tripped out of their trajectory. Terracon collapsed in the cold, wet grass, dragging Cassandra beside him. They were hot, both from standing beside the fire and from the sheer enthusiasm of the dance. Every breath that crawled from their throats seemed to be on fire. The long blades of grass along the slope brushed off their sweat and kissed them with night-chilled dew, which just then seemed far more refreshing than any bath they had had in their entire lives. The horizon held its place, but they could not overcome the whirling within them. They each sought an anchor and found it in their clutching hands. They stared into each other's eyes. Terracon looked into Cassandra's eyes. He can stand it now. Why now? What happened at De Toutal? What? He laughed defensively. He had understood her, but the question was too broad. Cassandra's question was earnest, but her tone betrayed her. You looked away. He furrowed his brow. Yes, you did, she smilingly accused. I was dancing, and I looked at you, and you looked away. I did not want to see you up there. It felt wrong, Terracon said. Cassandra's face made it clear that his answer was too short. I knew that you did not want to be up there. I could not stand to look at you, to watch your suffering. I just wanted you to be happy. A loud pop and a brownie shriek scared them both from their dizzy repose, and they sat up and stared down the slope. Brownies scurried away from the bonfire, and their thinning numbers exposed the precarious scenario. Rusty had fallen to her hip. The leather whip had caught her mid-leap, and she had been dragged from mid-air straight to the ground at the dwarf's feet. He had drawn a curved knife from within his boot and tucked it under Rusty's neck. Nicken! Terracon recognized. No! He climbed to his feet to run and shout. Opportunities would not be passed up in the meantime, however. Here the tracks end, Nicken growled at Rusty, staring her down through his rectangular spectacles. Where are they? It was a foolish mistake, easily mistaken for reason. A bare hand could grip a knife far more securely than a gloved one. A gloved hand, however, would have prevented Rusty from exacting her answers to the dwarf's threat. Innocently, she leaned her head away from the knife and pressed her cheek to his bare knuckles. The anesthetic of her touch loosened his grip from the knife and distracted him from his sure hold of her. Rusty played the opportunity to her full advantage. She slung free an arm from the loosening leather cord and caught the wrist of the dwarf's equipped hand. An unexpected show of strength wrenched Nicken to the ground. He landed flat on his back, hard enough to cough the air from his lungs. Orcon's howl at the sight of Rusty, threatened, shook every heart throughout the valley. The monster bounded from his seat on the slope in an arc through the air that landed his single crowning horn directly at the throat of the dwarf. The impact of Orcon's landing trembled the earth, and the quaking persisted through the demon's thunderous threat. "How dare you presume to affront me?" "Lord Orcon," Nasu wailed. "No, I beg you." "Nicken, what are you doing?" Terracon trotted down, Cassandra moving more carefully, but with the same urgency, behind. "Orcon!" Rusty shouted. "He knows them." Nasu clamored. "He is with us, my lord." Orcon turned to froth his rage at Nasu. "Do not presume my ignorance, mortal. I know that he is with you." Orcon turned an accusing eye back at the dwarf, whose face contorted under an ever-growing guilt. The rolling earth had no effect on Nicken. He could not feel it over the upheaval of his soul under the demon's stare. "I want to know why he presumes to affront me. I, the Orcon, he who is from before the beginning." "He affronts you on my behalf," Karen said. The weight of her mood seemed to anchor her against the tremble of Orcon's rage, even when he stared up at her. Karen never met the demon's eyes. Her attention was cemented to the dwarf. The wild rolling of the earth waned to a quiet tremble, then to the still of the night, broken only by the crackling fire and Karen's heavy words. "Is that not correct, Nicken? Is it not? You have come this whole way. You have done so to tell me where he is. Where is Dion?" Nicken could not answer. The fright had not drained from him yet. She gritted her teeth and clarified, "My brother. Do you know where Dion is?" She fell to her knees before Nicken, under the cover of Orcon, and rattled the dwarf free from his distraction. "Where is he, Nicken? Why is he not with you?" "The demon did not rescue him, so he must be with you. Why is Dion not rescued? Where is Dion? Where is Dion?" "What?" Nicken trembled. His composure was completely lost, leaving only the remains of a shaken, short old man. His glasses would not even remain on his nose, and his eyes flickered and pinched as they tried to discern who spoke, much less what they asked. It was a far cry from the smug dwarf they had come to know. "What? The fool? He would not listen. He chose his fate." "Oh no." Cassandra clapped her hand to her mouth and whimpered. "Not Dion as well." Karen's shivering was so deep it started to affect her breathing. Her brow dropped lower and lower, curling her forward. She leaned back to steady herself, but instead began to rock. "You too found him unfit to save." Karen's composure altered without warning. She stepped up, dragging Nicken by his collar. "That is the mercy you have. Let me demonstrate my mercy." Karen threw him back with a strength that could only be preternaturally mustered. Nicken landed on his back again, but this time the cough had been choked before it would escape. He reached to pry off the snare, but found only his beard tightly woven around his neck. Nicken dug his fingernails into the beard to comb back the hairs. The follicles were determined, though, and, agitated by his attempt to hinder them, they knotted themselves around his fingers, tying his hands to his face. The strands cinched tighter as Nicken's body began to convulse in its suffocation. He fought harder to free his throat, pulling so hard on the hairs as to pry them from his cheeks by their roots. Karen smirked, his subjugation feeding the intensity of her authority. The ferociousness in her demonstration could only be attributed to the blood of the wild Near running through her veins. Perhaps she was no direct child of the curse, but her line was drawn from the house of Hexen. By no other means could she enter the Order of Valish, the barracks that housed the generations of warrior brothers and sisters, indisputably cousins, every one of them. Among them Osmara, Draco, Dion, trained to serve, trained to conquer, trained to kill. This went beyond the scope of the Order of Valish, though. This was witchcraft in its cruelest, and Nasu had more mercy than that. He gave a long, hard look to Orcon, who seemed to understand. Karen's revenge had blinded her to everything except her victim, so she could not see Nasu approach Nicken and could not see Orcon near her. Orcon set a black claw softly on Karen's shoulder, distracting her, loosening her binds on the dwarf. Nicken grasped as Nasu drew back the stiff curls of his beard. Nicken turned over to retch and gasp. Nesu petted off the remnants of Karen's angry leash. With the tension between possessor and possessed finally broken, Orcon intercepted and directed Karen's train of thought. He would not listen. He chose his fate. He would not come. I would not take him. Orcon's size and girth was betrayed by the softness with which he spoke to her. His previous anger at Nicken had no credence after seeing Karen's need for news from the dwarf. He would not come, and I would not take him. Karen understood, but the light of acceptance was too obscured by the dark clouds of unsatisfied fury still crashing through her. She would get no apologies for the abandonment of her brother from the monstrous demon, nor could she choke them from the dwarf. Neither of them could apologize for him. Dion alone should justify his action to her, but he could not. Dion had taken her entitlement to his reasons with him, and neither would ever be brought back. Content acceptance would require that hope be set aside. Orcon pressed her to try, but it only stirred tears. She crawled out from under his touch and ran back to the lonesome dark, where even the light of the festive bonfire could not reach. "Nicken, you fool!" Nesu hissed. "I saw none of you. None of you. I could only hear the music and see the bonfire." "My lord, I beg your forgiveness," Nesu said, helping Nicken to his feet. "Take him from my sight," Orcon growled. "He could only be too fortunate to end his days without crossing my path again." Orcon snatched Rusty defensively and dressed her around his hip. He crashed back to the patch of grass, where he had picnicked through the night, then turned to Rusty with a soft look. They whispered in their secret ancient language while Orcon caressed and petted her, lavishing her with smiles and nudges. "Where's the music?" he barked suddenly. "Feast!" The cold humor of his mood melted when he looked back to Rusty's warm gaze. The musicians started their play immediately at Orcon's behest, but quite some time passed before the dancers reeled around the fire again. As the fire died and attendance dwindled, the musicians found themselves huddled around the last jar of Nin. Their drunken experiments in rhythm and timbre would clatter sporadically through the night, but were played more for their own amusement than any audience's. The dancers had left their light-hearted footprints in a ring around the embers, their tread-worn path leaning longest on one side closest to the bench where the food had been laid out. The teal-glazed vessels and bowls had been swept up through the night, taking back the scraps to be incorporated into the next day's meals. Terracon and Cassandra had curled themselves to sleep in an empty stable pen, the snoring of the neighbors keeping time through the night. The traces of fermented fruits and the quiet of satiated bellies had tucked them into their first quiet slumber in nights.